Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to Justice for All's webinar, The Land in Rhythm with the Prophet's Heart, a brief history of Islam in East Turkestan. Justice for All is a nonprofit organization based in Chicago with staff and volunteers in Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, Texas, Canada, and other locations. The organization, which was incorporated in 1999, grew out of advocacy efforts on the human rights abuses experienced in Bosnia and later Kosovo during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. At that time, it was instrumental in shaping the discourse around the quote, genocide debate and campaign to declare rape as a war crime in international law. And right now, Save Uyghur is a project of justice for all. I'm Aiden Anwar, your moderator for this webinar, and I currently serve as the outreach manager for the Save Uyghur campaign. I'm also an Uyghur American, so this particular webinar, is a topic close to my heart, as well as I'm sure other viewers as well. And before I introduce our presenter, I would like to point out a few housekeeping rules so we can have a streamlined experience, inshallah. At all times during the webinar, please keep yourselves on mute so we can have an uninterrupted session. And you can also use a chat box that will pop up on your right-hand side if you press the chat button on the bottom of your screen. And I will take all your questions and we can get them answered at the end, inshallah. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Rahman Latif. Rahman is a PhD student in religion at Columbia University. He is interested in vernacular religion and traditions of storytelling. He also holds a master's in religion from the Harvard Divinity School. And personally, I also know him because we went to undergrad at Duke together. And mashallah, he's been kind of known, or he was known in MSA as kind of like the storyteller and really passionate about history. And so we're excited to have him share that passion today in regards to a nation that is currently undergoing genocide and whose history is currently being systematically wiped out. And without further ado, I'd like to ask Rahman to start his presentation. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope everyone can hear me and hope you can see what I can see as well. All right, let's get started, inshallah. Today I'm going to be talking about a land in rhythm with the Prophet's heart, a brief history of Islam in East Turkestan. When speaking about East Turkestan, what I'm referring to is China-occupied Xinjiang, the territory that is occupied by Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples, a land really that's been Muslim and experienced Islam for over 1,000 years at this point. It's called, in many historical sources, the region, at least the majority of the region, is referred to as Alta Shahir or Yedi Shahir, 6 cities or 7 cities in Turkic, referring to major polities, but really it was more than just a few cities. So inshallah, let's get started first by talking about why should we study this history? Why is the history of the religion and religious experience in this particular area actually important? So as I'm sure all of you are aware who are watching this, East Turkestan, Uyghurs, the region is under siege at the moment. The Chinese state is enacting systematic oppression of the local population. People are being divorced from their faith, from their history, from their entire cultural kind of paradigm and way of looking at the world. This is actually a strategy of genocide. And the strategy not just of genocide of today, but even something we see that happened previously in forms of slavery before, in forms of domination. When you want to change a population, when you want to completely dominate it, you have to erase its identity. And history, the stories we tell about ourselves, are key to forming our identity, to making us into who we are. And if you remove that history, if you remove those origins or the imaginings about origins, people become a blank slate and you can do whatever you want with them. This is what the colonial paradigm is. When different colonial empires entered into places, they made it blank spaces. The Indians don't really have history, it's just poetry. Or the East Africans have no history. And once you make them have no history, you can do whatever you want with them. So that's, I think, the first reason, for an activist reason, to preserve identity, to further identity, to stop this erasure, learning this history is important. Secondly, I am Muslim, and that's a big drive behind why I care about these issues. And God says in the Quran, and I think it's a lesson that even non-Muslims can appreciate, that وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالَمِينَ. The Quran says, and of his signs, the creation of the heavens and the earths, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. So diversity of language, of cultures, of peoples is a sign of the divine. It's something beautiful. This multiplicity we see in the world, this great diversity we see in the world, is a sign of this divine unity. And every different faith, every different culture is a different way of pointing towards the divine, of enacting this sort of prophetic paradigm in the world. And to lose it, and is number one, a tragedy, but also for those that are even not a part of it, there's something can be learned from it. And then, of course, as we'll see throughout this presentation, the people of East Turkestan made significant contributions to Islamic civilization. They were a big part of this, imagined ummah that we talk so often about. And finally, it's kind of beautiful and entertaining and amazing in its own right. There's constantly filled with surprises, moments of awe. It's something just for the sheer joy of it that is worth being known. So, inshallah, let's get started at the beginning. And when I talk about the beginning, I'm talking about those sort of hazy origin stories. So hagiographies, which are biographies of saintly figures, are known for being a bit historically sketch, you might say. They don't always tell you what exactly actually happened. But what we, people who study these sorts of, as historians, as scholars of religion, can learn from them is how people viewed themselves, what people thought was important about who they were. It may not tell us exactly how the first Uyghurs or the first Turkic peoples of East Turkestan became Muslim, but it gives us an idea into what being Muslim meant at a later period. So Satuk Bughra Khan was a member of the Karakhanid kind of tribal confederation, a sort of Central Asian, in modern day East Turkestan as well, tribal confederation that eventually founded an empire, the Karakhanid Empire, that was a major Muslim empire in the 11th century through the 13th century. And so Satuk Bughra Khan, according to legend, was the first figure in this lineage, in this dynasty, to become Muslim and to make the others Muslim, to kind of propagate Islam. And so the account I'm going to be telling you today comes from I think 18th century hagiography of the figure, but it resonates. It has details that are, from hundreds of years earlier as well. So it may not be telling us exactly what happened in the 10th century when he passed away and when he lived, but it can tell us a lot about how people later on viewed this figure and what it can even mean for us today. So the hagiography begins, going way back to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, according to the story, is on the ascension. He's on the Miraj. He goes to the heavens. And he's by the throne of God. And from near the throne of God, he sees in the distance these figures, the different prophets who have lived, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and he recognizes them. But he also sees this fellow, according to this story, he sees this character who he doesn't recognize as a prophet. So he asks God, he says, oh Allah, who is this person? And he receives the response, this is Satuk Bughra Khan. He's a leader. He's the person who will bring Islam to Turkestan. That's how the text refers to it. And again, this is not an account. This story we don't find in the hadith, we don't find in the traditional sources, but it's again an imagined account with great weight. So the Prophet hears God say this, and he recognizes this person is going to bring Islam to this territory. And as the text says in Jeff Eden's translation, the Prophet listened to Gabriel's good news. Gabriel conveys this on behalf of God, and he rejoices. He praised God, and he raised his blessed hands, and he prayed, "Thank God that Turkestan is in accord with my heart." Or you can translate the Chagatai that it's written in other ways, that thank God that Turkestan is united with my heart, that my heart is made whole by Turkestan. Or in our very poetic translation, that the land is in rhythm with the Prophet's heart. So after this origin story, it goes into the story of Satuk Bughra Khan himself. He's a youth, maybe no more than 12 years old, and he has an encounter, well, perhaps he's hunting, with a sort of strange figure that tells him that you are Satuk Bughra Khan and you're going to become Muslim someday. That you're going to accept this faith. And he has no idea what Islam is at this point. And he tells this figure who approached him that, I don't understand what you're talking about. I'll see when I'm older and more aware. And according to the story, this figure is Khidr. Khidr is a Quranic figure, a figure who features in many Muslim legends and folklore as a figure, an immortal figure spreading the word of God, if you will. It's a trope character for these types of stories. So after Satuk Bughra Khan enacts with this figure, some years later, he travels and he meets a merchant from a Samanid background. So the Samanids were a Muslim Persian empire that occupied much of Central Asia at this time. So he's traveling a bit. He encounters a group of people from this empire, a group of Muslims essentially, and he sees them praying. And when he sees them praying, he's astonished by the acts of prostration, by the movements that they're making. And he asks the prayer leader, who became a teacher of his, what are you doing? And the man says, this is Islam. I'm worshiping one God. And we were aware that there's only one God, one Lord in existence. And at this moment, according to the legend, Sadr Burhan immediately accepts Islam. He remembers what he'd been told as a kid, and he accepts the faith. And then after he accepts the faith, he starts asking questions. Okay, who is this prophet? Who is this? Who is that? He starts asking all these questions and learning about the faith. So it goes to tell us that this conception, how did Islam begin? How was Islam imagined? First, it starts off very simply, as there being one God, and then immediately the prophet is important. That we can see that there are these sort of tropes that fit in with different sort of Sufi ideas of Khidr, of other sorts of figures that feature in this type of self-imagining. So after Sadr Burhan becomes Muslim, he begins to learn how to pray, and he teaches his followers how to pray. But when he says, come in secret at night, and we shall read the Quran and perform the namaz. This is what his teacher tells him, and I'll teach you how to do this. So he learns how to pray, his followers learn how to pray, but when he goes back to his confederation, to his tribe, he knows that Islam is not going to be accepted amongst them. The people are pagan, they are against the idea of Islam. It's a foreign faith to them, they don't like it at this point. So he hides his faith. And his uncle or his father, I guess, depending on the narration, hears a rumor that Sadr Burhan became Muslim. And he's very upset with him. So he commands Sadr Burhan, he says, I want you to make this idol temple. I want you to be the person that builds up this idol temple. Like, you're the lead architect and laborer for this project. And he's conflicted, Sadr Burhan. He doesn't want to build an idol temple. He only worships one God. So he prays to God, and I think this is a very powerful moment in the story. He prays to God, and he asks him, he said, oh God, I'm going to make this in the intention that I'm building a mosque, a place of worship for you. I'm going to, hide, my faith for the sake of protection, for the sake of survival right now, but my intention is to praise only you. And so he helps to build this temple, and he's building it so furiously that eventually his uncle or his father, whoever it is, gives in and says, okay, we believe you. You're probably not Muslim. But later on, the circumstances change, and Sadr Burhan builds up more followers, and he's able to kind of, take over, and then eventually kind of expand this, burnishing this fledgling empire and allow the faith to be practiced more freely. And so in this story, I find personally there's a great resonance for today, where the people of East Turkestan, Uyghurs, have a lot of difficulty practicing today. That sometimes Quran has to be whispered, that prayers have to be done in secret, just as Sadr Burhan had to do. But inshallah, there'll come a time where open practice will again be predominant. And we can see over here the tomb of Sadr Burhan. So let's talk a little bit now, more, I guess, material aspect of history about the Qarakhanids, who I mentioned. So the Qarakhanids, again, Muslim empire from the 10th century into the 13th century. And they were operating predominantly in what is now East Turkestan, and then they eventually had another capital in Kyrgyzstan. Their territory extended into much of Uzbekistan, really this larger Central Asian region. And we can often tell when it comes to empires, how an empire conceived of itself, what they thought about who they were and how they wanted to convey authority and who they were speaking to as rulers through their coins. Because coins are objects that literally everyone has it in their pocket, or people are picking these up. They're items that move. So it tells us, number one, who are they trading with, who are they trying to contact, but also how do they want to express authority to their local subjects. And so we have before us a Karakhanid coin, and there was a Karakhanid workshop that I'm getting this from. They kind of did the parsing of this coin. I have the details here. This coin is actually silver. It's not multicolored like you can see over here. They painted it so we can tell, which words go to where. But immediately we can tell, looking at this coin, those who have experience with numismatics, the study of coins, that it is very much a typical, in many ways, Abbasid coin, but with a few twists that make it also locally grounded. And this is a theme I'm going to keep returning to throughout this talk, that Islam in East Turkestan was simultaneously connected with the wider whole, was simultaneously universal and ummah-oriented, but also locally nuanced, added this local flavoring, this local beauty. So we can see in this coin, it says on this left side, in the name, it mentions where the coin was struck. So the stone was struck in Yarkand, one of the major cities of the Tarim Basin. It mentions the year that it was struck, the 5th century Hijri, excuse me. And then, as is in all Abbasid coins, it mentions La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu. So it mentions a formula of faith. There's no God but God, and he's one and unique, and there's no partner for him. And then this is where the unique twist comes into play. In this purple, it actually has a phrase in Old Uyghur. So it's a title of like one of the rulers in Old Uyghur. And this is done again because it's speaking to an audience that's, Muslim empires in the distance, an audience that's Islamizing slowly and steadily, and then also, talking to this older history as well. It's this kind of it's not just a transition point, not syncretism, but kind of, embracing this sort of local milieu, if you will. And we see on the other side of the coin, it has an ayah of the Quran around the side of the coin. So Muhammad Rasulullah arsalahu bil huda wa din al-haqq liyudhhirahu ala din kulli wa law kariha al-mushrikun. So the verse of the Quran says Muhammad is the messenger of God. God sent him with guidance and the deen of truth, the religion of truth, that he may, that it be made apparent upon all the faiths, and and it's condemning the pagans. And then afterwards, we see the title of the Abbasid ruler. So the Qarakhanids were their own empire, but they gave homage to the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, who had no real temporal power at this time, but was sort of a figurehead. And then it mentions the local ruler's name. And we can see in the local ruler's name, Nasr ad-Dawla is the first part of the name. So Nasr ad-Dawla is a type of, means like the helper of the government, of the state. And when it says this, it's using a title that's very common among Muslims in the Middle Ages. But it adds, again, some local nuance. Qadir Khan bin Bughra Khan. So this term Khan that I mentioned is an old Turkic word meaning like a king or a ruler. So we see this language entering even into the Arabic. We see this local understanding of rule, of being a chieftain, mixed in with this Islamic notions of a sultan, of a different type of ruler. And they're all combined. And over here, there's an Abbasid coin for reference. You can see how similar they look. So during the Qarakhanid Empire, so we can see this Islamic kind of language that's being used, but it's not just at the elite level of like economic discourse that we see Islam on the rise, but also in the literary production of the Qarakhanids. So a key figure that many of you I think will recognize from this time period is Yusuf Khas Hajib. So Yusuf Khas Hajib was born in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, which was also a Qarakhanid territory. And then he moved towards the center at this time in Kashgar. Kashgar is perhaps the most famous city of East Turkestan, one of the most historic cities of the region, and a major center of Islamic learning and of saints. We'll talk more about it, inshallah, later. But he moves towards Kashgar, and he kind of enters into the court of the Qarakhanid ruler, and he writes this work called Kutadgu Bilig. Kutadgu Bilig. So Kutadgu Bilig means in Old Turkic, so like the language before Uyghur, but it's still somewhat mutually intelligible. And actually all the words in this word are even intelligible in like Western Turkish of modern Turkey. Kutadgu Bilig literally means like the knowledge or the wisdom which gives this sort of royal fortune. So in this story, in this text, he basically talks about what ideal rules should be like. It's a text directed towards the ruler. And in many ways, he's talking about what ideal rules should be like, but he doesn't just talk about how the ruler should behave with justice. He also talks about the ethical formation of the ruler. So in many ways, this is a mirror for princes text. So mirror for princes texts are texts that kind of try and morph the conduct of rulers. And we see them especially in Persianate literature. Many of the most famous Persian mirror for princes that people know and read to this day were actually written after Yusuf Khas Hajib's work that was written, again, in a Turkic language. But it's not just a mirror for princes, it's also a mirror for the soul. So it doesn't just talk about this like ethical formation for the ruler, but it also talks about the sort of spiritual discourse more generally, about the idea of purification of the soul, a lot of Sufi norms, relating towards like knowing the divine and purifying the self with receiving the divine are embedded within the text. And what makes this text unique is not just this combination of ethical and spiritual paradigms, but also the framing of the text. So essentially, the entire text is composed of 6,000 lines that are couplets. Okay, so I think 6,000 or so couplets, all in sustained meter. And there are 4 major characters in the text who basically speak to one another. And all the ideas that Yusuf Khas Hajib is trying to convey come through these characters. So these characters are the king, who's named Rising Sun, who stands in for justice. Full Moon, who's a vizier, Highly Praised, who's the vizier's son, and Wide Awake, who's an ascetic. And each of them are not just fulfilling a sort of social role, but also there's some sort of value that's implied by them. So there's multiple layers of symbolism going on within this text that is, again, incredibly, incredibly powerful. And just to give you a few samples of what the text says. So the text begins in a way that's actually very common for a lot of Muslim texts of this time period, where it talks about, God, talks about the prophet is praising, and then it talks about speech in general. So there's several, it talks about, the four caliphs. A lot of things are very common to these types of texts from this time period. So an excerpt from the beginning, we can see over here. Unfortunately, for some reason, it's being covered for me by the by my Zoom box. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry. I don't know how to move that. Give me 1 second. I'm so sorry.
Somebody says it's actually visible for us.
Okay, I removed that. There we go. I think it's gone now, right? Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so it says I wasn't able to see it, unfortunately. So the merciful Lord sent his beloved messenger, the choicest and finest of men. He was a lamp to all creatures in the night of darkness. His light has spread so far that it even shines upon you, the reader. There's another passage from later on in the text where he's talking about, what the purpose of the slave is and how the slave can please God. The slave being the abd, the servant of God. So the slave of God is the one who relies on his worship alone and cannot find the way to God's pleasure by himself. If you desire what pleases God, then desire what pleases the Muslims. God has no need of your service to him. Therefore, perform your proper servitude and seek to win a good name. Whoever has the name of slave, his job is to serve. A slave who does not serve has the name only metaphorically. Be constant in your service then, for this is true servitude. So serve your fellow man to serve God. Again, embedded within this text. So let's move on to a different figure within this time period, a contemporary figure of Yusuf Khas Hajib, but offering in a different space. So Mahmud Qashqari, who passed away at the very beginning of the 12th century, was from Kashgar, again, in East Turkestan, and eventually he made his way with the rise of the fortunes of the Uyghurs Turks of the Seljuks to Baghdad, to the court of the Caliph. And the Seljuks, this Uyghurs Turkic, so a different Turkic branch of rulers, kind of dominated the political landscape, but the Caliph was still a central figure during this time period. And so he presents this text called Diwan Lughat al-Turk to the Caliph. And this text, really in the history of Islamic civilizational texts in general, is almost entirely unique. So it is a compendium of the Turkic languages. So essentially, it gives a sort of lexicon of the different Turkic dialects that existed from the time period, a sort of modern aerial linguistics, if you will, but also putting in nuggets of history, of social circumstance, of poetry. A lot of common proverbs that we hear today are actually embedded within this very same text. So in the beginning of the text, he starts talking about why he's writing it. And so he mentions in this text the fortunes of the Turks, why it's important that people know them, why is the Caliph even asking to know them. So he talks about a hadith that he once heard. And he mentions he's not sure if it's authentic or not, but the message of it still rings true. That the hadith says, learn the tongue of the Turks, for their reign will be long. So the Turkic peoples, the Uyghurs, the Karakhanids, and others will rule for a long time. And then Mahmud Qashqari says, if this hadith is sound, if this tradition of the Prophet is sound, and the burden of the proof is on those, those who doubt it, then learning it is a religious duty. And if it is not sound, still wisdom demands it. So he's advocating even the learning and understanding of this language. And then again, in another early passage in the text, he talks about different Turkic varieties that you hear in different places in Central Asia and in East Turkestan. So he talks about Balasagun, which is in Kyrgyzstan, which is the capital of the Karakhanids. And he also talks about Kashgar over here. And he talks about how they're different varieties of Turkic and Kashgar, one more Persianized, one less Persianized. But again, at this time period, in the middle of the 11th century, literally in the 1070s when this book is written, we see, these languages being predominant in these areas, alhamdulillah. And in his work, I mentioned he has a lot of historical nuggets. So something Mahmud Qashqari does is he sort of takes the people of East Turkestan and Turks more broadly and puts them into the sort of lineage of Islamic history on a wider scale. What I mean is those idea of biblical lineages, right? The sort of idea of, they say people are Semitic, right? So the son of Shem, which is one of the sons of, there's a particular lineage that comes from this biblical narrative that was very influential among Muslims, among Christians, among Jews. So he takes the Turkic people and he fits them into this narrative as well. He puts them into this sort of biblical lineage. They're in Islamic history, like the prophetic history as well. So he talks here about, the Turks are from, there's like 20 tribes or so. And he mentions that, they all trace back to the lineage of Turk bin Yafith bin Nuh, of Turk, son of Yafith, son of Noah. So he puts it again into the ark. He's putting the people into this sort of lineage. Elsewhere in his text, he not only fits the sort of biblical lineage for his people, but he also puts Quranic stories in conjunction with the lives of the people of East Turkestan. So he talks at one point in his text, and I believe this is a translation by Robert Devereux, if I'm correct, that the king, this Turkic king, goes to the eastern lands, and Dhul-Qarnayn, who's Alexander the Great in the modern Qur'an. Dhul-Qarnayn is a figure who features in Surah Kahf, the 18th surah of the Quran. And he's also considered, equated with Alexander the Great quite often. So, there's a battle essentially between this Turkic king and Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is defeated, but afterwards, to make peace, he built cities of Uyghur, and he remained there for some time. So at this time period, the word Uyghur referred to a smaller group than it does today. It was of the Turkic groups that became the modern Uyghur. It was a smaller subsection, but he made cities, in the north of East Turkestan at this time period, according to this legendary narrative that's contained within this text. Again, fitting Quranic history into the history of his people. Sometimes the imaginings of history, tell us more about what people want to be and how they act than, the nitty gritty of, oh, this happened, that happened, etc. And something his text, the one of Lughat al-Turk, and you'll see it's actually in my background as well, if you can see the little video clip, is that he has a world map. But it's not a traditional world map. It's a world map that is centered on the Turkic lands. So the typical world map of this time period, both in Muslim lands and Christian lands, everywhere really, was circular. And for the Muslims, especially, typically south was in the top of the map and north was in the bottom of the map, and Mecca, Medina was in the center. Because he wants to talk about the Turkic peoples in particular, he actually puts the Karahan domain in the center. So Balasaghun, this over here, you can see like a English translation version of the same map. Balasaghun is in the center of the map, essentially. That's what's important right now. And we can see beside Balasaghun, again, in this imagining of the world, Kashgar, Yarkand, Khotan, places that are predominant parts of East Turkestan. They're all in this map. And something else that makes this map unique, and I've never really seen one quite like this, is that the top of the map is actually the east. It's Sharq, right? So that's very different from the traditional map that has south at the top of the map among Muslims, or even the traditional Western map that has a north at the top. So very unique over here. And we can see in the bottom of the map, we can see over here the land of Hijaz, that's Mecca and Medina, India off to the side, all these territories that we talk about, it's just a different angle of looking at them. So after, let's fast forward a little bit. So Mahmud Qashqari passed away in the 11th century. Actually, the beginning of the 12th century. We're going to fast forward a couple hundred years to a different circumstance, a different kind of awareness of East Turkestan. Not talking about a figure from there, but somebody who visited the land. So Saadi Shirazi, which many of you may recognize, was perhaps the most famous Persian poet, besides Rumi, perhaps, of all time. He's considered at least one of the 5 most famous Persian poets of all time. And he wrote this text. He wrote 2 very famous texts, one called the Bustan, one called Gulistan in Persian, that were essentially trying to formulate the spiritual and ethical kind of life of the reader. And they're texts that not just when he wrote it, he published this work, Gulistan, in 1258. Actually, the same years that the Mongols conquered Baghdad, he published this text. It wasn't just at that time that it was being read, but even to the present day, you will find this text being read and being lived. If you go back to education in the 19th century in South Asia, before the British really changed things, this text was probably the most important text besides like the Quran as like a primer for young students. So in this text, he tells lots of stories in the Gulistan. And one of the stories is about his visit to Kashgar. So he says that he goes to the congregational mosque in Kashgar, and there he meets a young grammarian. So this young grammarian, he describes in radiant terms, is teaching Arabic grammar to a group. He's discussing Arabic grammar with a group of other students. And Saadi comes in and he makes he makes some jokes about Arabic. He tells him he's from Shiraz. And the grammarian doesn't recognize Saadi, but he knows that in Shiraz there's a poet named Saadi who's very famous, whose poetry he's heard. So he asks Saadi, he said, "Oh, can you tell me some of the poetry of Saadi?" Again, not being aware. And so according to Saadi's story, he tells him some Arabic poetry that's kind of comical. Then the young man asked, can you tell me some of his poetry in Persian? Because Persian is even more understood than Arabic for us. And then Saadi tells him some poetry in Persian. And eventually, the young man finds out that this is actually the poet himself. And he embraces him, and Saadi eventually has to leave. But he says upon leaving, his experience was such with this young man in Kashgar. If I do not die of grief on the day of farewell, do not count me as honest in my affection. So we can see from this story a few things, whether it was historic or not, whether Saadi actually visited this place or not. And we can see in 16th century artistic miniature depiction of this story, that Arabic learning, Arabic grammar, understanding the Quran, understanding Islamic legal texts, has a long history in East Turkestan. This young man was teaching grammar, Arabic grammar, in the same manner that it was being taught in other places. Furthermore, Persian poetry, Persian literature, cultural norms were also had like deep roots within the land. A lot of scholars talk about this idea of the Persianate, and other terms that are somewhat different, the idea of Balkans to Bengal, that this entire region had a sort of Persian vibe, that Islam was talked about in Persian quite often. There was literature infused with norms about the divine. Essentially, there's an entire space of imaginary, the same sorts of poetic tropes kind of existed with this language in this space that can be employed in different ways in different places, but in a way that also kind of honored this sort of shared unity amidst the diversity. So very much Kashgar was a part of this wider sphere. So we can see, I mentioned that Arabic sources were predominant. So I did just a quick search of a few Arabic sort of manuscript sources and sources that talk about the works of different author. One text, maybe some of you may know it, Hidayat al-Arafin from the 19th century, especially was a major source. And it just goes through in Hijri years, some of the major authors who were publishing works that had wide circulation in Arabic, that were about the traditional Islamic sciences generally. And we can see over here, again, in Hijri years. So I only searched for Kashgari authors. No other cities may have many authors, but to make it simple, I just searched for Kashgar. And immediately we can see, in the 5th century Hijri, so in the 11th, 12th century, there was an author of a book on Adhkar. A century, 2 centuries later, there's a noted author on Sufi texts. This figure over here, Imam Abu Abdullah Sadid ad-Din Muhammad al-Kashgari. As you can see, the name Muhammad was common everywhere in the Muslim world. East Turkestan was no exception. Wrote a Hanafi fiqh, he wrote many works, but his most famous work was a Hanafi fiqh work. So Hanafis are one of the 4 major Sunni schools of law. So he wrote a work on like jurisprudence in this school of thought called Munya al-Musalli wa Ghani al-Mubtadi. And this work is so widespread that you actually see commentaries on this work as far away as Damascus. So there's a tradition among like Muslim authors in the Arabic tradition, especially, of writing commentaries on works. You explain different terms, you expand upon it. So this work was, had many expansions and commentaries in a diverse variety of regions. We can, fast forward, within another century, another author on like general nasiha, on advice, one talking about miracles of saints, Sufi texts, adab, tasawwuf, usul, and then even into the modern day. This last piece, if you can see it, talks about this is 14th century Hijri. This was literally 100 years ago. Less than 100 years ago, we see, a little over 100 years ago, perhaps, no, excuse me, less than 100 years ago, we see a major muhaddith, a scholar of the hadith, who had many students, according to the text I was reading about him. And this is just a small sampling. So very much involved with that wider understanding of Islamic religious learning. So in 1258, I mentioned the Mongols took Baghdad. But a few decades before that, Mongol conquerors had actually conquered East Turkestan as well. So the Karakhanids didn't survive very long into the 13th century. And during this time period, for the next couple of centuries, the Chagatai branch of the Mongols. So the Mongol Empire divided into 4 pieces. And the Chagatai Khans, the Chagatai Khanate, ruled East Turkestan. And then eventually afterwards, different offshoots or groups that were related to them ended up having rule. And the original Mongols were not Muslim, but in the 14th century, they converted to Islam. And the way these type of stories go is usually there's like a saint that comes and according to the hagiographies, again, the legends of saints, usually a saint comes, he converts the ruler, and then like everyone converts. Now, historically, it probably didn't happen that way. It was probably a more gradual process. But this story, I really want to tell, and I'll explain why in a moment. So Jalal ad-Din or Jamal ad-Din Qataki, from the city of Qatak. Qatak is a lost city in the Takdimakan desert. So a city of East Turkestan that was lost to the sand. And there's actually some interesting stories about why it was lost in the different hagiographies and histories, but we won't get into that now. So he has an encounter, this Jamaluddin or Jalaluddin has an encounter with Timur Tughlaq Khan, who's the major, who's at this point, according to the Tariq-e-Rashid version of the account, which is perhaps the most famous version of the account, is a prince of the Mongols, and eventually he's going to become Khan himself. And Timur Tughlaq Khan is kind of affronted by this, saintly figure, and he asks him, almost in a way to insult him, but out of some curiosity. He's like, "Oh, you're a Muslim, you have this faith, but I don't understand what this is." He says that, "Look, I have a dog, okay, this dog of mine. I wonder, is my dog better or are you better?" Really, he's trying to insult Jalaluddin. "Is my dog better or are you better?" And Jalaluddin responds by saying that if I have faith, and I practice my faith and I die upon my faith, then I am better than this dog. But if I don't have this, then this dog is better than me. So it's this, and this really strikes Timur Tughlaq Khan, and he makes promises to eventually convert. And, according to Tariq al-Rashid account, he converts at the hands of the son of Jalaluddin when he actually becomes Khan himself. And then afterwards, the Chagatai Khans become Muslim, and eventually they even spread the faith. Now, the reason I wanted to tell this story, despite it perhaps not having, great historicity, is because I actually grew up hearing this story. My father told me this story when I was a kid about the saint visiting the Mongol Khan and, telling him about the dog and about faith. And my father did not know this wider history growing up. He was not from a place where he would have known this history, but this story made its way to him. So the stories about faith, about identity that are told in East Turkestan have such resonance that they find, lives far away. After looking up the history of this Tariq al-Rashid version of the story, I did a Google search, and actually I found that one of the first results was a telling of the story in Indonesia. An Indonesian newspaper was telling the same story. So it has like a wide range. And this trope of like a dog and faith, it's an old trope. It goes beyond this particular incident. There are different texts that use this kind of idea in different ways, but it goes to show that the stories of East Turkestan had a wide resonance, and also they were participant in the themes and topoi, the sort of narrative elements of other parts of the sort of wider Islamic imaginary. So I mentioned now that so the different, the Mongols and Mongol successor states, became Muslim. They participated in spreading Islam to new areas. Really, we see under them that like the land becomes overwhelmingly Muslim eventually. In the 15th century, Timur the Lame, was a sort of Turkic conqueror that conquered, much of the known world, and especially Central Asia. He conquered Anatolia, the wide swath of regions. And the reason I especially want to talk about him is because there were certain cultural formations that began to develop, especially under the rule of his successors. So he established a short-lived empire, and his children and grandchildren, they broke it up into different states. But in one particular state in the 15th century, late 15th century, we see a flourishing of Chagatai Turkic or Chagatai Turkish. So Chagatai Turkish is especially an academic term to refer to this because it was predominant in former Chagatai Mongol lands. But essentially, it is a literary Turkic language that is the direct literary ancestor of modern Uygurce. So the modern Uyghur language is directly descended from this language. And the authors that wrote in this language, in this wider cultural sphere, so not just writing in East Turkestan, but other parts of Central Asia, even Babur, the conqueror of India, the first Mughal emperor, wrote his own biography, his own memoirs in this language of Chagatai Turkic. So it was a very widespread language, really like along with Persian, it was a major literary language of this wider region. So Mir Ali Shirnavai, who's the figure pictured over here, is perhaps the most famous writer in Chagatai Turkic. He's in many ways considered the father of the sort of literary standard of the language. So he was a Timurid minister in the government in Herat in modern-day Afghanistan. And when he lived at the end of the 15th century, turn of the 16th century, it was perhaps one of the greatest cultural and intellectual flourishings in human history. So not only was he an author of incredible works of poetry and prose, a very sophisticated author in both Persian and Chagatai Turkic, but he was friends, very close friends, and his spiritual mentor was actually Jami. Jami was one of the other 5 greatest Persian poets. Incredible poet whose work spread everywhere. So he was close friends with him. In fact, Jami brought Mir Ali Shirnavai into the Naqshbandi, this Sufi order, the Naqshbandi Sufi order. He also lived and he actually helped to sponsor Bahzad. Bahzad was a famous miniature artist, an illustrator of the time period. He sponsored him. He lived at the same time as Hussein Kashafi, who he actually knew. Hussein Kashafi wrote perhaps the most famous narrative of the death of Hussein radiallahu anh, a narrative that he actually, I believe, and others actually translated into Chagatai Turkic, but had incredible afterlives, across this wider region. So he writes, Mir Ali Shirnavai, a book where he compares Turkic with Persian, and he argues for the superiority of Turkic. He writes in this work, "Then I reached the age of comprehension, and God, whose praises I recite and who will be extolled, instilled in me sensitivity and attentiveness and a desire for the unique. I realized the necessity of giving thought to Turkish words. The world which came into view is more sublime than 18,000 worlds, and its adorned sky, which I came to know, was higher than 9 skies. There I found a treasury of superiority and excellence in which the pearls were more lustrous than the stars. I entered the rose garden. Its roses were more splendid than the stars of heaven. Its hallowed ground was untouched by hand or foot, and its myriad wonders were safe from the touch of other hands." So he compares this language, this ancestor of Uyghur, of the language of East Turkestan, to a treasury of star-like pearls. It's incredibly beautiful. He talks about different linguistic features which actually do feature in the language today, that have been preserved in the language today. They're just, absolutely incredible, and he shows the beauty of them. So, there's this unique identity, this local nuance. There is a language, this own, language in its own self. But also this language relates itself back to other languages of the Muslim world, to other foundational language. Pearls form when there is like some kind of creature that kind of irritates a clam, an oyster, and then this kind of bubble sorts of forms in the oyster, and then it's filled up and a pearl kind of forms. So you need this sort of interaction. A pearl doesn't just form on its own. And so we see these are some words in modern Uyghurche that have Arabic and Persian roots. So perzent, right? I'm saying this in the Persian pronunciation. It's farzand in Persian. We can see there's an F to P shift in the pronunciation. It means child. Or kitab, which means book. Or mu'allim, which means teacher from Arabic. Bagh, which means garden. Gul, like the word for gulistan, that word of that Saadi used, the flower garden. It means flower in Uyghurche. Marjan, which is the word actually for a pearl or coral or even a pearl necklace in the Persian and the Uyghurche usage, comes from Arabic through Persian. So they're all interconnected. It's this wonderful mixing that produces such great beauty. So to move a little bit further in time period and to focus on East Turkestan again in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the life of another saint whose name was Muhammad Sharif. So Muhammad Sharif lived during the time of Abdul Rashid Khan, who was a ruler in much of the Tarim Basin, a descendant, I think, of the Mongols or some other Turkic rulers. And Muhammad Sharif came from, perhaps Uzbekistan, from Bukhara, to Kashgar. Kashgar, again, which I said was one of the cultural centers of East Turkestan. And after coming to Kashgar, he made contact with the local ruler, and he actually, from sort of dream visions that he was having, he came to the tomb of Satuk Bughra Khan, the figure I mentioned at the beginning of our narrative, the sort of Islamic foundational figure. He actually visits his tomb right outside of Kashgar, and he kind of maintains the tomb, and he has visions of the saint, and he relates back to him. And then eventually he goes on Hajj. He takes a route towards Hajj to visit Mecca and Medina, visit the Prophet's grave, and then return. And this particular version there's several editions of the story. I believe the one I read was a 17th century translation, a translation of a 17th century text. Jeff Eden again did the translation. So in the story, he travels from Kashgar through India, actually. He goes through modern day Surat in Gujarat, and then he travels from Surat by sea to Mecca and Medina. And during this time period, in the middle of the 16th century, Surat was actually becoming a major cosmopolitan center, where traders and peoples of all different places, from all different lands, were gathering in this one center. And especially, I'll talk about Surat because I actually have relatives who live there today. So it's funny that he passed through the city on his route. But again, a major cosmopolitan center. So we can see from this story immediately, we haven't even finished the story yet, but the Muslims of East Turkestan, by way of the Hajj, by way of trade for a city like Surat, were connected not just intellectually, but physically with the rest of the sort of wider, Muslim domains. That they were involved in the movements and the trade and the discourses of these travels. So he returns after his visit to the Central Holy Lands to Kashgar, and then he kind of embarks on a career of founding holy sites. where he has different visions and dreams, and he rediscovers the tombs of different Muslim saints that populated the land. And with the help of Abdul Rashid Khan, he kind of raises up, different masajid, different mosques, different, tombs, according again to this hagiography of him. And what we can see in this story is that the life of Muhammad al-Sharif was very much similar to other hagiographies, other saintly narratives. And this idea of dream visions is also a sort of wider discourse. But there are certain particularities of it, the way he sees the characters, that are also very local and very unique. So again, there's this discourse between the universal and the local. We see take place once again, even in this sort of narrative. But in addition, we see that he finds in his own life, he sees the importance of implantment, that Muslim graves, the Muslims who are buried, the saints that came before, the people buried in the soil, make the land Muslim. Like seeds, they are the source of the forests that grow, the forests of Islam that grow in the land. They are sources of barakah, of blessing. We can imagine a land that has Muslims buried there, a land that has the stones themselves have been soaked by the adhan for generation, is a land where Islam isn't shed off easily. Islam is in the soil in Muhammad Sharif's very story. So, from the 16th century onwards, and I'm covering, I guess, a lot of ground over here. Again, it wasn't just this discourse of saints in particular, which again, these saintly stories, like Muhammad Sharif's story, when they were written down, they were often told. They were read and they were told orally. There was visitations of the shrines of these figures that had these stories told about them. And this was a major way that people learned their own history. For centuries with different variations. Riyadh Thumb has an excellent book on this that's way more nuanced than I can capture in this short time. But again, it wasn't just these particular sites or this like elite literature, what have you, that represented what Islam was in the land. It was also that, daily discourses, even the music was infused with Islamic norms. So this is a drawing by a friend of mine, an artistic depiction of Aman Nisa Khan. So Aman Nisa Khan is again another legendary figure. She's talked about first in the middle of the 19th century in history of musicians. But her life took place in the 16th century. In fact, according to the narrative, she was actually the wife of Abdul Rashid Khan, the ruler I mentioned earlier who helped sponsor Muhammad Sharif. So she helps to preserve what are called the 12 muqams. So the sort of wide, musical cycle that's still told and practiced and alive today. And within this like cycle of music, different Sufi tropes and norms are preserved. So it's very much this, again, local music fused and imbibed with all these different varieties. We can see over here depictions of different instruments of East Turkestan. So to fast forward a little bit more, I mentioned earlier about the Naqshbandis, if anyone remembers. I know I'm mentioning a lot of figures and places, so totally okay if I'm moving a bit too fast, my apologies. But I mentioned the Naqshbandis were a Sufi order. That this Sufi order, like many Sufi orders, connected itself, right? It was a sort of set of spiritual practices or spiritual community that connected itself in a spiritual chain back to the Prophet. That these teachings, according to the claim of the Sufi order, were taught by the Prophet to Abu Bakr, his companion, and eventually they were taught to Jafar as-Sadiq, who is a descendant of both Ali radiallahu anh, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and of Abu Bakr, who was a descendant of Prophet ﷺ himself, to several other figures, right? And there are different branches that arise from the Sufi order. So this Sufi order, along with several other Sufi orders, become very predominant in East Turkestan. A lot of major figures, elites, and perhaps locals and non-elites as well are involved in these sorts of discourses. So I mentioned earlier about Mir Ali Shir Navai. So Mir Ali Shir Navai was inducted into the Naqshbandi order by Jami, the famous Persian poet. Jami in turn was inducted into the order by a fellow by the name of Saad al-Qashqari. So of someone by the name of Saad who seemed to have come from Kashgar. A major figure of the 15th century, not just in East Turkestan, but all throughout Central Asia, even into Anatolia, was Ahmed Yasavi. Ahmed Yasavi was another Naqshbandi writer. And now finally to talk about this image I have over here. So this image is a particular simultaneously genealogical and spiritual lineage of the Apak or Afak Khojas. So the Apak or Afak Khojas were a group descended. So the main figure was Apak Khoja, who became a ruler of Kashgar in the late 17th century. And him and his entire line were descended as we can see, these different circles going back up to Makhdum al-Azam, who was Ahmed Kashani. Ahmed Kashani was a major Naqshbandi figure of the 15th century. So his descendants in the 17th century become these sorts of these kind of worldly rulers with a sort of spiritual lineage, this kind of simultaneity, right? Again, when I'm saying that Sufism is dominant, I mean like literally dominant in the land. But of course, in the midst of Jungarian and then Qing domination, the Apak Khojas often did not have power afterwards. But even when they were not temporally in power, they were kind of the symbols quite often of revolt, of rebellion against Qing domination, the Qianlong Empire's domination. So we see this quite often, that different revolts arise around these Apak Khoja figures, these sort of Sufi leader figures. And even Yaqub Bey, who erected a state in the late 19th century, was in some way or the other, in a complex manner, connected with and kind of dealt with these figures. So again, to move into the 19th century, again, moving quite quickly because there's a huge history and we're just touching the surface, really just a glimpse of the wider whole. I want to give us sort of, again, another material or perhaps literary image or snapshot of what Islam was like. So this is the 19th century, early 20th century, just a little over 100 years ago, that a figure by the name of Gunnar Jarring. Gunnar Jarring was a Swedish diplomat, came to East Turkestan, and he collected a lot of manuscripts. In total, he collected over 500 manuscripts being handwritten texts. And he brings these texts back to Sweden, and alhamdulillah, they're accessible as for research. And in fact, over 200 of them have been digitized. So you can see them today. And they give you, again, a kind of snapshot, not just of what he was interested in, but what types of materials, what sort of literary texts were read or being recited in the land at, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so we see, a history of Yaqub Bey. This is a small sampling. The poetry of Mir Ali Shirnavai, the figure I mentioned earlier, his works had resonance in these lands. The poetry of Ahmed Yasavi, the Naqshbandi figure I mentioned earlier. Works on the Miraj, the ascension of the Prophet. Stories of the Prophet works, especially Raghabuzi. So Raghabuzi wrote in Khwarizmian Turkic, which is the same language essentially that Yusuf Khas wrote in, a sort of ancestor of Chagatai. So he wrote a stories of the Prophet collection that was translated into Chagatai that was very much alive within East Turkestan. And you can imagine these types of stories of the prophets were quite often recited. Different folkloric texts about, Mola Nasruddin, or Nasruddin Effendi, or Nasruddin Hoja, this sort of comical figure who gives ethical kind of knowledge, whose kind of his folkloric stories are spread all the way from East Turkestan to Turkey. They even morphed into a different figure in Egypt, very widespread. We see these type of texts telling his stories. There are also futua manuals of various professions. So futua it's often translated as Sufi chivalry. It's sort of like quite often, but not always, a guild-oriented kind of development of spirituality across Central Asia into Anatolia. One of the major figures was a late Abbasid Caliph, and like the development of it has many manifestations. But we see within his collection several manuals for different professions. So there's a text about blacksmiths, a text about, I think, people that deal with the weather or something, several different texts. And each one of these texts kind of give like a weird, they tell things that the person should recite, words praising God. They also tell stories about the prophets that relate towards this profession. Oh, you're a blacksmith? Well, Dawood, the father of Solomon, was involved in this profession. So we can imagine these texts were probably used in the different guilds and these centers, kind of giving the sort of vernacular spirituality. Again, all these texts I'm mentioning over here are written in Chagatai Turkic, which again, it's continuous into modern Uyghur. There were even, and I love this, there were even commentaries of Sadi's Gulistan in Chagatai. So the Gulistan I mentioned, where Sadi the poet talks about visiting East Turkestan, that was actually commented on in Chagatai Turkic, in the very land that he said he visited. We also see translations from Persian and Arabic into Chagatai Turkic and into what is now like Uyghur. And these translations weren't necessarily word for word translations. They were also interpretive. They take the same narrative and deploy it in different ways. They add on to it. So Hussein Vaiz Kashafi's work on the deaths of the Hussein radiallahu anh and his companions. Jami, who I mentioned earlier, who's involved in Mirani Navai, his famous telling of the story of Yusuf and Zuleikha. Works of Al-Ghazali, the famous synthesizer of the 12th century, were translated into Uygurche. Khalila Wadimna, the sort of Indic and then Persianate and then Arabic collection of, and then again Persian. It moves all around, fables, animal fables that talk about just rule and ethical behavior. Ferdowsi, who wrote this narrative of the Persian like epic sort of poetic history. It's translated. The story of Amir Hamza, so it's this epics that are based upon the life of the Prophet's uncle, but going crazy different directions that have nothing to do with his actual life, which were really predominant in India especially. We see them translated into Uyghurce. And we also, and of course, these are my favorite type of text personally, we also have different hagiographies, stories of different saints. And these collections of saints, some of them are international, like, trans-regionally renowned figures. Abdul Qadir Jilani, Ibrahim bin Adham. These are figures that, are honored as far away as Morocco and Surabia, like from Morocco to Indonesia. These figures are honored, but also several local figures. Khoja Abu Nasr Samani, the guy who brought Satuk Burhan into Islam. Jalaluddin Kataki, who I mentioned earlier. Satuk Burhan, the Apa Khoja, other descendants of Makhdumi Azam, other Apa Khojas. And in fact, even Yut Bibi Padisha. Inshallah, I'm trying to translate this text. We'll see how it goes. It's a text about a female saint of Yarkand. So it wasn't just men. Oftentimes history, we often talk about the male figures. I mean, the entire society is participant in these sort of things in various degrees, in various ways. And these are little excerpts of the different texts. And so I just want to, move from there. I talked a bit about, this literary tradition in the late 19th century, early 20th century. We can imagine that Sufi sites are being visited, that these stories are being told, they're recited. You don't have to be literate to hear this sort of information. And in the 20th century, this doesn't stop. In the 20th century, despite Chinese oppression, of the time period, still Muslims were writing. Muslims were participant in like different reform movements that were common across the Muslim world. Different scholars arose. A figure who I think is really emblematic of what happened in East Turkestan is Muhammad Saleh Hajam. So Muhammad Saleh Hajam passed away 2 years ago in 2018. So Muhammad Saleh Hajam wrote an Uyghurce translation of the Quran in a commentary, essentially. So he's a great scholar, and it's a beautiful translation. So it says, and forgive my pronunciation, this is the same ayah, the same verse of the Quran we started the presentation with about the diversity of tongues. So he writes, Allah nang asman learning, zemin yarat khan laki, tillaring learning, rengilaring learning, hal muhal bulushi, Allah nang alamat lari dandur, buningda bilimnik kishiler. Like this beautiful translation of the same ayah we talked about before. The entire translation is like that. So he was taken into Chinese custody. And he died in Chinese police custody. They said, oh, he passed away. Allah knows what he underwent, but he passed away in this custody. And today, his daughter, I believe, is in a camp. His daughter is also in this sort of custody. So very much Islam was practiced, Islam was rich despite oppression. But today, especially, there's increasing turmoil and oppression and attacks against religious practice. And to give, one more example before, I get to my conclusion. So I mentioned Muhammad Sharif, the great saint of the 16th century, who worked with Abdul Rashid Khan, the local ruler. So this Karavaluk Grand Mosque was a mosque, this major, Friday prayer mosque in Karavaluk, that Muhammad Sharif, according to legend, was the one who said it should be founded. He told the ruler, he said, I want you to build a mosque here. And it was destroyed in 2018. It was demolished in 2018. After surviving and even being redeveloped and expanded over hundreds and hundreds of years of existence, it was destroyed in 2018. And this is not the only site. There are dozens of sites of shrines of different saints, of mosques, places that have been visited for centuries, that have been the centers of celebration and learning and telling these sorts of historical stories, have been demolished. God have mercy, but I mean, this is, but again, as in the case of Muhammad Sharif, where he sort of rediscovered lost saints, so too can these sites grow again and be rediscovered. So to sort of recap a bit of what I've been saying. Again, it's a lot of information, I know, and it's a very brief take on a wide and rich history. Islam in East Turkestan was simultaneously self-consciously Islamic. It was part of the wider ummah while simultaneously being attuned to local identity, with having that local nuance, and there wasn't a contradiction. They didn't perceive a contradiction between that. Today, academics might come in, today, Orientalists might come in, whoever might come in and find contradictions. Oh, this is syncretism, this is this, this is that. No, in reality, this was something that was perfectly normal and natural. It was a part of all of these wholes completely. It wasn't the mixing of two pures. It was itself something, radiant by itself. East Turkestan was a part of the Persian literary sphere, as we saw, and Uyghurs and different peoples of East Turkestan are direct inheritors of Chagatai, one of the great languages of Islamic civilization. East Turkestan was firmly connected with the rest of Islam in both of networks of people and objects, being trades and texts, materials, and all these different sorts of ways. The Islamic sciences, tasawwuf, etc., were all also alive and well, along with the different literary narrative and romances. All of them, they were all alive in East Turkestan. And the land was constantly made sacred, and its sacredness was reenacted through the burial and lived remembrance of saints, of different figures who were exemplars in the path of the divine. And so the 4 question and answers, oh no, that's blocked out. Let me see if I can get a better view now. It's weird that it's, I don't know if you all can see it. I can't see it, unfortunately. So there's this, so in the text of Mahmud Sharif, the saint I mentioned earlier, so in the hagiography about him, there's a dua, a sort of supplication to God that he makes, that it's attributed to him. And so I just wanted to very quickly, I guess, read through at least a portion. I think, unfortunately, the image isn't showing up over here, at least on my screen, a portion of this prayer that he made, this dua that he allegedly made. And it's in Chagatai Turkic. And those who know Uyghur, you'll probably understand quite a lot of it. Those who know Persian will probably understand quite a lot of it. It says, Maqsood sen e khuda, ma'bud sen e khuda, masjood sen e khuda, sen manga faryad ras. That's the refrain that comes over and over again. Sen manga faryad ras. Sen ilahim khuda, sen quwahim e khuda, sen penahim e khuda, sen manga faryad ras. Asi kulung durmen fakir, jafi kulung durmen hakir, nafs ilide buldum asir, sen manga faryad ras. Ey razik ey hay kadim, afu elegay sen ey kareem, hajat raqir ey rahim, sen mangar faryad ras. Like over and over it goes through. And Jeff Eden, who translated this text, gives a translation as well of this prayer at the very end. So he says, you are the aim, you, O Lord. You are the deity, you, O Lord. You are the adorned one, you, O Lord. You are my defender, faryad ras. You are my Lord, O God. You are my witness, O Lord. You are my shelter, O Lord. You are my defender. I am your disobedient slave. I am your barefoot slave. I am tiny. I am a prisoner in the hands of the lower self. You are my defender. O ancient living provider, forgive me, O generous one. Provide what is needed, compassionate one. You are my defender. Endless sins I have committed. With every breath I cry, I cry, alas. On judgment day, my book is black. You are my defender. I am weeping, O Lord. I am most alive, O Lord. I am in confusion, O Lord. You are my defender. I discover your scent at the hour of dawn. I cry aloud in your lane. A vagabond, I've walked your path. You are my defender. I am mad and restless. I am weeping in misery. I cry bitterly in separation from you. You are my defender. So, a prayer hundreds of years old in this vernacular language that I think has a powerful resonance for all of us even today. All I personally can say, is Ameen, may God accept. And so with that, love to open the floor for any announcements that have to be made by the organizers, but also comments and questions. I'm also a student of this. I consider myself a complete amateur. I'm here to learn from you, and I hope you've benefited something. And I ask your forgiveness and God's forgiveness for any mistakes or, obliterations of nuance, fumbles that I have made. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Rahman. That was a really great presentation. I think a lot of people have been watching on social media as well and commenting how first impressed they were, and someone commented that this kid's not he could probably be Uyghur because of how much history he's been explaining to the audience, and I myself learned a lot, so thank you again. For anyone with questions or comments, please go ahead and use the Q&A box at the bottom. It's there for your purpose. So does anyone have anything to add, any comments or something that you guys would like to share?
So I see something about access to the PowerPoints. Yeah, I can happily, either download it or give a link to the PowerPoint. I'll give it to the organizers, and they can hopefully send it out to people. And I can also, I didn't include a bibliography, but I'm happy to maybe within a week or so put a bibliography together for the sources I used and send them out as well.
Okay, well, nobody's asking questions. I'm surprised because there's a lot that was covered. Hina, do you have anything to add? Hina is also one of our panelists today, or not panelists, she's part of one of the co-sponsors from Muslim Matters, also the director for Justice for All.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair. This was wonderful. I just the connection. When we speak about this in just the framework of oppression and genocide, and you forget all the rich history and the ties of the ummah, and just the words that you were saying, and I could hear those words in the poetry that has been recited in my own home, and subhanallah, like the traditions, and that was, and yes, we know it, but just to see it in the way you presented it, jazakallah khair. I wanted to ask you, current, if you could do a little bit of what Islam was like currently. Were there madrasas teaching Islam right before like 2017? What was, how was Islam spread at that point? If you could.
And I think you're cutting off just slightly. I don't know if it's just me. Do you mind repeating the last part of your question?
Yes, my question was, what was the current status of Islam in East Turkestan just right around 2017? Was it taught in madrasas? I would really like to hear a little bit more about current status as well.
So I think, someone who's been resident in East Turkestan, who I think many in the audience have, could probably answer this a lot better than I could. But just to give a sort of maybe related answer, not exactly answering what you're talking about, Uyghur students, until very recently, were also going abroad to study Islam. So there were a lot of Uyghur students in Al-Azhar being one of the major centers for Islamic learning in the world, in Cairo, in Egypt. And then again, another sort of emblematic of what's happening in general, the Chinese government requested their extradition from the Egyptian government. And like all Muslim governments in great cowardice, they actually sent them back. So to this time period, there are people, regularly, learning the deen, traveling to learn the deen in different ways. And then these modes of knowledge transmission were disrupted. We can imagine, into the current period, decades or 2 decades ago, it wasn't as bad. Probably in the more Sinicized areas like Urumqi, for example, there was a little bit less of this transmission in the public sphere. But in other areas, it was even a bit more public. But again, it's just, there's even greater and greater degrees of removal and oppression. But I think someone who's been there, again, can talk a lot more fluently about it.
I'd also like to add that essentially right now, practicing Islam is essentially prohibited in all aspects, except for when it comes to the 5 pillars, except declaring the shahada. Practicing all other pillars are essentially criminalized and can land someone into a camp or prison. It's come to the point where even saying assalamu alaikum is considered a crime and can also land someone into a camp or prison. And a lot of Uyghurs, and I'm sure there are some attendees or listeners who can attest to this, but if we ever manage to get in contact with some of our relatives or loved ones on WeChat, you would rarely hear them greet each other. We wouldn't greet each other with assalamu alaikum. And so I think that itself is a it kind of sheds light on how much Islam is cracked down upon, and how the smallest acts that we deem as kind of a normal act is basically putting into camp worthy for the Chinese government. In addition to that, I mean, you may have also heard about Muslim names being banned. Things like names like Muhammad, Fatima, the classic Islamic Muslim names that you hear of are also prohibited. And if somebody has these names already, they are highly encouraged to change these names to Han Chinese names as well. So again, this, for those who did not know this is just an extra fact that you guys can keep in mind when thinking about the scale of oppression and religious restriction happening. So somebody else also commented and asked, what can we as Muslims do to show our Uyghur brothers and sisters that we are with them even though we are far?
So I think, Aidan, you should take that first, and then I'll give some supplementary answer, but I'd like to hear your answer more.
Okay, well, I'm a moderator, so I'm like trying to limit my answering questions, but it's hard to, I guess, hold back. And I also realized that with this, attendees can't really like say the question, so they have to type it out. But I'll try my best. I mean, obviously, dua is the number one if you're a Muslim praying for us, or if you're of any other faith as well. As praying for our people, I think, is the number one. If you're a religious leader in your community, really prioritizing this issue and making it something that is talked about, I think, is number one. Because I feel like even for the longest time, being an Uyghur person living in America, I've witnessed even during khutbahs, for example, during Jummah prayer, a lot of khatibs would forget to make dua when they're making the dua for oppressed populations at the end. That's like a very small example, with regards to how forgotten we have felt for the longest time. Alhamdulillah, I think that has been better. I think a lot of people are stepping up on this and really making the effort to learn more and prioritize this cause. So, may Allah reward all those who have been doing so. But in general, it's just doing your part individually in your community. I don't know who asked this or where you're from, but if you're from the States, there are a whole bunch of action items that you can be doing to contact Congress and the Senate to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, or just in general, just getting involved in your in trying to advocate for the cause with your government, and just honestly making sure that this conversation and what you've learned today or what you've learned in general about what is happening is a conversation that is constantly happening, and that we're constantly proactive in trying to figure out what to do. So I think that's a short answer to your question. And I think we'll move on to the next one, inshallah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, obviously, yeah, okay. So that has been, I guess I addressed that in the shortest way possible, since we are getting close to running out of time. So there are a lot more questions that people have asked.
I'll answer maybe a bunch at once, perhaps. So in terms of Islamic languages spoken in East Turkestan, so today Persian and Arabic aren't really spoken as much. I mean, a lot of like the religiously learned would know Arabic though. And we actually see like novels talking about, a Uyghur student or traveler going to Hajj who actually already knows some Arabic. But if we're going back, 100, 150 years ago, then, Uyghur or Chagatai at that time period, Persian and Arabic were the common literary languages. Most Islamic law texts would be written in Arabic. In other places, I'm not as much familiar in the circumstance, we do see like certain like law primers written in Persian or another kind of like vernacular. So that happens occasionally, but more so we see like literary texts, poetry written in Uyghur and in Chagatai and in Persian. And we see like hagiographies especially would be written in Uyghur. A lot of texts that were in Persian would be moving in there. A text like kind of general spirituality texts, texts like a lot of Al-Ghazali's works, which were kind of for like everyone, but talked about a wide range of religious practice, would also be texts we'd see in translation, for example. And then in terms of the role of saints, shrines, and the preservation of local culture and language more recently, so very much like, shrines were and until the present day, until like literally until their destruction, were very much centers of, remembrance of these sorts of histories, of the stories of these saints. These stories were told. In many ways, these stories of saints are stories that are embodied. People learn religious values and morals and ways of being from these stories. They're not things on paper that you just pick up. They're things that you kind of live, you enact. And these sorts of festivals and visitations were very much involved with this. But something you see, especially in the late 20th century, is the rise of like a culture of novels. So a lot of the history was preserved within novels in East Turkestan. Like novels quite often would tell a lot of these stories in a more colloquial format. And so even the Satak Bughrah Khan, who I mentioned, for example, a lot of people might not know that hagiography, even though it was a very like predominant hagiography, they might know the similar story through a popular novel from like the mid to late 20th century. And inshallah, you can access a lot of novels today online. There are a lot of YouTube readings of novels. There are a lot of websites. Unfortunately, not many things have been translated. Some hagiographies have been translated into English, and a couple like short stories, etc., but there aren't that many that have been translated, unfortunately. Okay. Then CCP, Islam and studying it. How do I understand the difference? I think it. So
can you also address what the question is before answering?
Okay, so it says it is clear that CCP see Islam and studying it as clear forms of terrorism, yet China has very close relations to Muslim countries like Pakistan. How do we reconcile this? So I attended a talk recently by Ryan Thumb, who I think is much more of an expert on this subject than I am, where he talks about the difference between the Hui and the Uyghurs, right? And why is it the Hui? The Hui are like ethnically Chinese Muslims because their Islam is seen, and even now they're actually facing some oppression, right? But because historically their Islam was seen as more Sinicized, and the Uyghurs' Islam was seen more different, more foreign to Chinese values or modes of expression, what have you, they were not oppressed as much as the Uyghurs themselves were oppressed. In terms of, again, China has close relations with Muslim countries like Pakistan for economic reasons. To build these different sorts of pipelines. There's a pipeline that was being built through Pakistan, a port that was being built in Gwadar by the Chinese government. These are economic decisions. And for the same reasons that they're building things there, Muslim countries themselves have unfortunately not been at the forefront of activism, have kind of denied, really completely and utterly denied what's happening. Because, they want, the dollar is a greater deity to a lot of these governments than God. If we're putting it in an Islamic mode of thinking, unfortunately. So the next question was, before Islam, what did Uyghurs believe? So this is an interesting question because really this identity I'm talking about, this idea of Uyghur that we're talking about, is something that was forged through the crucible of Islam. It was an identity very much formed with Islam. There were Turkic tribes that were starting to migrate to the region, everything before Islam. But like this identity in particular was very much forged through Islam. Now, if you go back over 1,000 years ago, there were Manichaeans, there were several Aryan peoples in East Turkestan, there were Buddhists, there were shamanistic beliefs, all these things did exist. But various forms. I think one of the comments is saying practice all forms of religion. A lot of these forms of religion were very much practiced. And then, in the 10th century, Islam begins to rise, and for the next several hundred years, it really increases in predominance. The interesting thing about this question, there was different beliefs before Islam. There was literature. The old Uyghur Empire that the people today take the name from, eventually became a Buddhist empire, and there are amazing drawings that are preserved in caves from this empire. Everything. The issue is that unfortunately, sometimes the Chinese government wants to talk about this pre-Islamic history and deny the Islamic history. You jump back over 1,000 years ago. Oh, that's what people really are. This Islam thing, these people aren't really Turks. They're not really this. They're not really that. They want to deny this history, right? So I think it's important also, these are all, again, different legacies, of course, absolutely. But the Islamic history, unfortunately, gets very much de-emphasized, or when it is emphasized by the Chinese government and others, it's emphasized in a way that, it's radical, it's terrorism, it's this attack, blah, 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 all of that. But as we've seen, it's actually something rich and beautiful. Jazakallah khair for the next one. How to respond to people that still deny the genocide. Again, I think it takes a little bit more, but the thing is, people will always, unfortunately, blindness is willful, right? A lot of times sometimes people are just ignorant, they actually don't know, and when they know, they'll be awakened to something. But oftentimes people are just, because of their particular station, their social position, they don't want to see what's happening. So it's the same way that it was happening in Palestine. We all know, everyone's known for decades, and it's very much in the public conscience, but people still deny it. People still kind of neglect this narrative because of their own social political positions, because people, again, we live in a post-truth era where there are many truths and people refuse. So I think, how to respond to them, though, I think being open and honest, sharing these sorts of videos, sharing these sorts of stories, sharing testimonies. Alhamdulillah, the activism has really become, this activism has been going on for a very long time, but internationally, a lot more attention has been paid recently. I mean, when I say a long time, I've seen a document by one of the Muslim World League organizations from the 80s, where Muslim countries came together and wrote a letter saying, China, stop oppressing the Muslims, right? Obviously, it's gotten a lot worse today, right? So it's been going on for a long time, but now it's much more in the international light. So I think it becomes easier to share different types of media that talk about this. So there is a comic, for example, depicting the life of Mihrigul Tursun, which conveys this, tragedy to people in, I think, a very powerful way. There are academic studies that do this. There are increasing numbers of YouTube videos and, documentary style work being done. So I think there's a wide variety of sources that we can share, and, honestly, just repetition, and talking to people, sharing these stories is a powerful way to do it. So was the conversion mostly through worse? No. No, I think this is a narrative that often people give. They're like, oh, conversion, people converted to Islam. Because if we look back in the 8th century, the early 8th century, the kind of Umayyad dynasty actually made its way into Kashgar. And they actually conquered that territory for a short period of time in that time period. But Islam did not, it was spread, war, they took over. But Islam did not spread after that time period. Islam really spread beginning especially in the Kara Khanate era. So yes, there was, different rulers are conquering different lands, what have you. But even when something is conquered, the people aren't just becoming Muslim. It's more so the kind of gradual acculturation of Islam. The presence of different saints, remembrance around tomb saints, different migrations, these stories kind of spreading that people gradually become Muslim. There are moments of conquest that introduce it to a new area, but it's much more a gradual social process than something that's like, oh, it's war, what have you. And even then we say, oh, it's spread through war. It's like these very people that converted, are the ones waging war and conquering. And, it's much more complicated. People want to make everything Islamic seem foreign. But as I think we've seen over here, it's something that's simultaneously of the world and of the local variety as well. Are these heritage sites, novels, and cultural acknowledged by UNESCO? Can by any means? How can we know this history? So unfortunately, UNESCO really doesn't have much power when it comes to protecting these type of things. When we think of Palmyra in Syria, like UNESCO definitely raised a fuss about like Palmyra being devastated in the conflict in Syria, which is definitely a major UNESCO site, one of the most famous Roman whatever sites in the Middle East. And it really didn't do much. It raised attention because they were able to talk about things being looted. And actually, in some ways, it was kind of sad that people were more willing to talk about the material things that were being looted and destroyed than the peoples themselves that are being destroyed. So can they be protected by any means? I think like these avenues of like cultural protection, et cetera, can be ways of talking about these types of things for sure. And I think someone else who knows more about the UNESCO connections and what is protected, not protected. Actually, I think a lot of things are listed. UNESCO's like World Cultural Heritage thing, like the 12 maqams, like different items like that are listed there, but there's no like force. But I think this is a good way to learn about this. So how can we as a non get to know this history? Inshallah, I'll send out a bibliography of various texts. A lot of texts are quite academic, unfortunately. So sometimes the access can be a little bit difficult. Also, like a lot of work is still being done in this history. There's so many people, so many young academics, so many like popular students who are starting to do work on this, who are translating texts, reading texts. So I mean, these are various ways. Inshallah, just checking.
Somebody also asked towards the beginning, could you recommend a couple of books about East Turkestan?
I think it'll be easier. I'll send a little bibliography to people rather than butcher people's last names myself. Inshallah.
I think there's a couple questions in the chat box, not the Q&A. Somebody asked, can you recommend books to learn about the Chagatai Turks?
Same thing about, I'll send a bibliography within a week, inshallah, but also Tariq-i Rashidi, it's a translated text. I think it's been translated at least once or twice. It was a 16th century text written in Srinagar, in Kashmir, actually. The ruler was a cousin of Babur, the founder of the Mughals. He was a local ruler in Kashmir who also wrote this text in Chagatai Turkic, where he talked about the sort of Chagatai Khan, like the history of the Chagatai Mongols. So that Mongol history and the conversion to Islam, it's all in that story. And there are other variants of these type of stories, but there's like beautiful details and like little things. When you read one of these pre-modern histories, again, it's very different from histories today. They're not so much like, this is exactly what happened, we have to be super objective. They're telling stories, right? And they're constructing narratives and identity and moral lessons through these types of histories. But it's really worth a read. It's just a fascinating text. Is it helpful to born in Chinese good here and let business establishments know what? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's, Aidan again can talk more about this. There's, in Congress, the discussion about, stopping this, forced labor, companies from relying on forced labor. We've seen it worked in South Africa, this boycott and divestment. It's working in Palestine, which is the reason why there's such a push against BDS today. So absolutely it can be helpful over here. I think individuals can make a difference, but also, inshallah, if like states actually on that higher level also make a difference, I think that can do quite a lot. Yeah, and I think you're being asked to just share a few points. Yeah, Baburname wrote it in Chagatai. Yeah, as what he's saying, he wrote the Baburname in Chagatai Turkic, and it is amazing. So that's also been translated. The Baburname has been translated by Wheeler Thaxton, a beautiful translation, and you can find, I think, pretty easily online, like the Chagatai versions of the text too. It is such a unique text and such a beautiful text. He talks, again, this is like a conqueror for he's conquering India, right? But he talks so much about fruits, and he talks nonstop about different fruits and Samarkand or Uzbekistan, where he's from. And many of these types of fruits he's talking about, they exist in East Turkestan today. Everyone loves melons. This is really a land of fruits. And you can imagine, because he was from these types of lands, he has this connection for the first thing he talks about a new place is their fruit is like this or that. It's an incredible text, very much like a culinary history and not just a history of conquest. He also talks over and again, it shows you something about the values of like someone like him, but also of the wider time period. He talks about poetry. Like every time he introduces a new figure, he's like, oh, this person they were a good poet, or they're a bad poet, but a good person, because these sort of rhetorical norms and ethical norms, everything's kind of brought together in this time period.
I think those are all the questions that have been submitted. Somebody asked, somebody just asked on Facebook, I have a little question about primary sources in academia. How are scholars accessing materials for studies today? Because I'm finding fieldwork is impossible.
Yeah, so some scholars were there. They actually were able to do fieldwork. For other people, it's impossible today. There are several manuscript libraries that have sources. So the Jarin collection I mentioned in Sweden is perhaps the most well-known, but I think there are other collections in Germany and other places that have like a lot of these like manuscripts that are there. But again, it's not everything. We can imagine there are whole archives that are being destroyed. There are just waves of text that are being destroyed that we don't know anything about, which again, it's definitely a challenge. How do you write a history? How do you tell a history that's being destroyed? I think there is something, again, very powerful, like oral narration, I think is really important over here. Talking about people's works, yeah, as I think Uyghur mentions, Riantham's Sacred Roots of Uyghur History, he was actually able to do field work. He did his research before like this most extreme crackdown. So he talks about a lot of these different hagiographies and these different types of works. But it's difficult. But there are sources, they can be found. There's so many works that have never been like translated, or even in these like collections, there's so many works there that even there have not been fully read. And that we can return to in new ways, inshallah.
Somebody also commented on Facebook that Sean Roberts' War on the Uyghurs book covers the current restrictions by the Chinese regime extensively. He basically says that being Muslim has been equated to being a quote extremist or a terrorist in East Turkestan. So for those who want to learn more about the current situation, that's another book that you can look into. It's called War on the Uyghurs by Sean Roberts. And then there's one more last question by Hussein Ali. How much do you think the Uyghur uprisings or protests do you think contributed to China's current policy, and what were the conditions before the protests?
And the thing is, China will use these protests as an excuse to crack down more, right? But I think one of the big turning points, not just protests and uprisings, but also kind of the shift in discourse globally, where after the war on terror in America, China began to employ this sort of rhetoric for referring to the Uyghurs and using this to kind of further oppression. And of course, the crackdowns would definitely increase. Like after 2009, of course, crackdowns increased. But even in the present day, it's much more just like changes in like state policy, etc., that are causing this. Then like, oh, they're responding to a protest or an uprising.
Yeah, I would say specifically after 2009 is when we started to see the really increased crackdown using surveillance, and then slowly the construction of these concentration camps and prisons. Basically, they claim that these protests, that these Uyghurs are prone to extremism, terrorism, and that we need to quote unquote cleanse the virus from the Uyghur people's brains. And that's their basic justification for putting people into these facilities and carrying out this genocide. I think that those are the last of the few questions. And before we conclude today, I wanted to give the floor to the Free Uyghur Now Student Coalition that was recently formed. They were also co-sponsors of this event. So Iman and Tasneem, would you guys like to say anything?
Yeah, first of all, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for coming. And Abdul Rahman, thank you so much for speaking on this issue. It's so important, and it was honestly really enlightening to hear about this. So again, thank you. And thank you, Aiden, to being a great moderator and just doing a great job with hosting this event. And thank you, Justice for All and Save Uyghur for being amazing co-sponsors. And if you guys are interested in learning more about us, we're a student coalition. You can follow us at Free Uyghur Now on Instagram or Twitter, and just DM us if you're interested. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
And a quick note for this coalition, mashallah, was started by a group of non-Uyghur students at Yale and then UMD, and then has slowly spread to universities across the United States. And mashallah, they have grown on social media, I think with over 25,000 followers on Instagram, and they have constant action items that they're posting and information, infographics that are really helpful for the younger generations that are active on social media. So please take use of that and, It's just for me, it's at least touching to see that these initiatives have been taken, because for a while I feel like a lot of us Uyghurs felt like we were the only ones doing work, or trying to get this issue out there. And alhamdulillah, now we can see that this issue is now being, is actively being worked on by passionate people around the world, including this group. So jazakallah khair for everyone for joining us today. I hope you guys learned a lot, and inshallah, we do have a recording on this, so for those who want to rewatch it or watch it later again, you can, for those who haven't watched it, who want to watch it later, they can go back and go through the PowerPoint, inshallah. So again, thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you guys next time.